Welcome, welcome, welcome. We have strict time compliance instructions, so I'm going to really try to move us back onto schedule-ish, if possible. So we have about 45 minutes in this talk, and unless anyone else has heard otherwise, and we just can cancel all the time plans. And Liz, I'm looking at you. No, we're trying to stay on schedule. So I would love to have a sense before I start this, because I'm seeing different faces who I recognize, and I don't really know who's in this room or exactly where to gear this. So please, first of all, ask questions as I go if you want to hear more about a particular slide or an idea, or feel free to say like, this, we know this, feel free to go more quickly. That's also fine. You can be like, wrap it up. That would be a good sign for me. But how many folks in the room work in conservation? Just so, okay, most. How many people work in ag? Oh, a lot of same hands. Okay, cool. How many folks are students? Anybody? Cool, sweet. Any policymakers? Okay, great. Just trying to get a sense of who we are. So thanks for coming. My name is Grace Odell. I'm the Executive Director of the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Vermont. And I'm going to be speaking today about drawing some connections between climate resilience, farm viability, and food security, how those things are all connected and what conservation might have to do with those desired goals that we're climate resilient and food secure as a state. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about an initiative that is coming forward through a coalition called the Vermont Food Security Roadmap. And so we will be connecting how we can work on all of these different goals through a cohesive climate resilience, farm viability, and social justice plan that we are calling the Food Security Roadmap. And we think it has a lot to do with Act 59 and with all that's going on in the state. So we're excited to be able to have this here today. And I see that a few of my coalition partners who are also working on this together with NOFA are here. So feel free and empowered. Just get in here and do this with me if you want. So a little bit more about NOFA, just because not everybody knows what we're up to. NOFA is an organization that was founded over half a century ago. It is a farming organization, and it's driven by farmers and farm workers and led still by farmers and farm workers. So we were founded by a group of folks who thought that they could farm in a way that worked for people and the planet at the same time. And they started organizing each other and themselves and doing peer-to-peer training, peer-to-peer support, getting a farm started. And we've really retained this member leadership over the last half century. So we remain governed by a majority farmer and farm worker board of directors. We are participatory, meaning we have committees like a policy committee or an education committee of our membership that directs our work. And that history is really important to us to remember. We are particularly jazzed about participatory organizations right now because we see that they are so necessary for the successful functioning of our democracy. We need people to be involved in organizations where they can articulate what matters to them and then take action on making that happen. So NOFA is proud to be member-led, and we'd love to have you involved. So we see food and farming as where people, land, and justice come together. And this is just a succinct way of saying sort of, again, if we can get food and farming right, how we grow our food, how we tend our land, and how we feed our communities, so much else will come and flow from that. So this is a little image that someone who's an artist and works with us at NOFA drew to sort of articulate, look, a farm, especially here in Vermont, the farm is the center of our community structure. It's a rural institution that undergirds the successful functioning of our healthy communities, right? So if you get small scale, appropriate scale farming right here in Vermont, you achieve local food security, you achieve civic engagement, community hubs, mutual aid, strong local economies that are resilient in the face of much larger, larger economies that have brittle supply chains. You also achieve an active working landscape. You are more climate resilient. You have long-term soil health that is growing and building over time. You have more biodiverse landscapes. You protect natural resources. This all can come through supporting farms. on the landscape. So just a little bit more about NOFA. Our mission is to promote organic practices to build an economically viable, ecologically sound, and socially just Vermont ag system that benefits all living things. And our vision is that Vermont remain home to thriving farms and agriculturally rooted communities that will support the long-term well-being of the earth and all its people. So I feel very lucky to get to do this work every day, because when I think about what's the work that the world most needs, I think figuring out how to get right our relationship with each other and the land is really the big question of our time. A little bit more about what we're up to and what we do. We have a number of areas that we work. So as the organization started, we were really focused on farmer support services. This looked like practice development and knowing actually how to tend the land and grow food in this way. And it also looked like business planning. How do I make a business that's viable? Now we do a lot of transition planning and transfer planning when folks are retiring or trying to get out of farming. So we still have a strong organic practices team as well that works on helping folks adopt climate resilience practices. And we are on farms all around the state. And after a number of years doing that, we started hearing from the membership, hey, we also need to advocate upstream for policy change and for different leadership goals, laws that will govern us to be able to do this better. So we developed an advocacy and policy team, and we work here in the state of Vermont. We also work nationally and internationally. So we work on in coalition. We're members of the National Family Farm Coalition, who is in turn members of La Via Campesina, which is an international peasant-led farmer movement. And we are in solidarity with the goals for food sovereignty as a goal for folks growing all around the world, long-term just land tenure, and a just transition from the economy we have now to the economy we really need. So we are in a lot of different coalitions. The coalition I'm going to be primarily talking about later in the presentation is a Vermont coalition, but there are many others that we work in our state, in the country, and in the world more broadly. After many years of advocating and working on farmer business development and farmer practice adoption, we started hearing, hey, you also need to work on the eater side, right? Like really work on helping folks who are not farming become agriculturally literate, remember why this matters to them, and to get involved. So we built out a market development team. We also work in farm to school and sort of building on that side, on the demand side of things. And part of that is our mission to make all the food that's grown here also accessible to folks from all economic realities. So we have a food access team, we administer EBT programs, and we really are looking for solutions that work for limited income eaters and for farmers. And finally, we do education and community building events. We get people out on farms, we have a big conference. And we own the certification agency, Vermont Organic Farmers. So this is when you see the organic seal in the store that has been inspected by someone and certified. Someone has verified the information about the practices that farmer is doing or not doing on the land. And so we certify about between 700 and 800 organic farms here in the state of Vermont to the organic standard, which is nationally governed. So the main thrust of my talk today is about not just the work that NOFA is doing, but about the work that a number of us have come together to do in coalition, and that's called the Vermont Food Security Roadmap. And I'm going to be coming back to this, but I just want to introduce, this is what we're talking about. This is an effort that's going to go through 2035, and in 2035 we have achieved true food security. We'll remember this moment when you first heard about it, and no one is hungry in the state. So also to tee us up, I want to just frame up what I think is at stake in this moment, why we're here at a conservation conference. Feeling a little bit sweaty because I know much less about conservation and conservation policy than many of you in the room. And I also know enough to know what happens now is really, really important. What's going to happen now is going to govern what we do with the land, how we protect the land, whether our state is livable, how healthy our state is for people and the planet. So the vision of Act 59, this is in the language of the bill itself, is to maintain an ecologically functional landscape that promotes climate resilience, supports working farms and forests, and supports the historic settlement pattern of compact villages surrounded by rural lands and natural areas. We think that is very well aligned with the goals expressed in the Vermont Food Security Roadmap to 2035. Because being food secure is the outgrowth of climate resilience, farm viability, and communities being valued in the context of a healthy landscape, which is what conservation can help make happen. The roadmap contains recommendations that are going to speak to how we might do all of these things. So it's a really important document and guiding path that's going to sort of point to the how we might get there when we have these big audacious goals that then get really mired. And we need to do conservation in a way that honors that people and the land work hand in hand. We flourish together, and we need to do conservation in a way that is thinking about supporting life for people and the planet, and do conservation in a way that moves us to true food security. So I'm going to step us through a few of the things that farmers are up against right now, and just really flesh out the picture using some data and some anecdote about what we're up against right now. So the four major buckets that I see farmers facing, and I hear about a lot, are increasing land costs. I'll talk more about all of these, but extremely high land costs. Corporate consolidation within the food system and within land ownership. The economic reality of small farming. This is just like, what is the basic condition of trying to be a small-scale farmer? And then intense climate crisis, whether that's flooding or heat or disease and pest pressure. So this is just this water in which we're swimming. So I'll just sort of flesh out each of these different areas to make this feel a little bit more plain. Corporate consolidation looks like fewer and fewer companies owning more and more of the food supply chain. This is not news to you, but it is extremely affecting what it means to try to do small and appropriate scale agriculture here in a state like Vermont. And as we have bigger and bigger ownership over the whole supply chain, we're also seeing the same pattern in land ownership. Fewer and fewer large corporations, often operating in many other shell companies, are buying land and aggregating that land. So since the 1950s, our government has really pushed this, get bigger, get bigger, get bigger. That's going to be the way our subsidies are set up. That's going to be what allows you to get paid out when you have a extreme climate event. All of our systems are set up for a large consolidated agriculture. Here's an example that recently affected our state, right? So Horizon, the organic milk brand, the organic dairy brand, was bought by Danone, which is an international, one of a very few number of massive parent companies. And they realized that it's a lot more expensive to produce small-scale organic dairy in Vermont because you have to move the cows all the time, and we have a small land base, and it takes a lot of people labor. And so they decided that they're not interested. And all of the farmers who were signed to Horizon got dropped, essentially overnight. They got a very short time period to learn. So when you're pumping milk into milk trucks, it's not like you can easily quickly pivot and sell elsewhere, right? So 87 farms lost their contracts because it's cheaper for Horizon to produce milk in Kansas or Arizona or some large flat place where there's a lot less human labor and where there may be less stringent certifiers who are more interested in profit maximization and a sort of vertically integrated whole supply chain situation where Horizon can make a lot more money. It really completely screwed over a lot of farmers in our state. And we have been scrambling. A number of those farmers simply went out of business. Some of them pivoted and got picked up by another buyer because of the help of a lot of folks working together to try to figure that out. But that's just an example. And I remember, because I was sitting in a lot of meetings with these executives and really trying to impress, like, do you understand? I really had this feeling like if we could just tell some of the stories of the families who had completely lost their livelihoods overnight, or the land, what it was going to mean if we no longer had land being managed in organic dairy in Vermont, what was going to happen to that land? It's a really significant amount of our landscape that's in organic management has been in dairy. And I thought if we just could make that clear why it's so valuable and why it matters to these people, surely they would come to their senses or work out a longer time horizon or care in some way. And what we really encountered was, no, it's really about, for corporations, it is about profit. And so what that indicates to me is we need to build power, cross-coalition power, cross-sector power to say we really must care about the people and the landscapes together that we're tending and come together, because small farmers alone don't have the power to stand up to big consolidated corporate ag. It's all of us together who can stand up to that. I don't need to spend a lot of time talking about climate crisis here in Vermont after 2 years like we have just seen. But to make this very clear, this is not just flooding. We've also had the year before flooding, a very intense drought year. We had early frosts. We've had some strange weather that's just not following our typical weather patterns. And then we've had really catastrophic flooding the last 2 years. And so this is both a national problem. And one thing I would really like to stress is we have an excellent relationship with our federal delegation. We have a federal delegation who cares about our land and people right now, and they want to make more funds available after there are catastrophic events, and often there are not those funds left anymore. As you've been reading about with Hurricane Helene, there are not leftover FEMA funds. We are out collectively. We need a congressional act to make freely available more funding. Our Congress is not super functional, if you might have noticed. And a lot of people are just waiting until the presidential election to feel like anything is really possible to shift at all. There's a big breath being held about what happens in the event of of the election. So what this means is like the scale, the timeline of the climate crisis is really, really out of whack with the timeline of our political process. We don't have the plan and the policy in place right now to fund the scale of climate emergency that's happening. So last summer, we also had what happened on Hawaii, right after what happened in Vermont, right? This is just two examples, and I remember speaking with our delegation and hearing, we have about $20 billion left, and we have $300 billion in asks. So the need is really out of whack. This is from some of our farmers here. These are some strawberry fields. This is a wash pack shed. So this is what folks trying to provide food are dealing with regularly. Seems like every July 11th, but after the 2023 flood, this is just to say, like, it wasn't just the flood last year. It was the flood coupled with an incredible amount of rain that came for a really long time and just didn't abate. So even if folks weren't like literally flooded underwater, many, many people lost whole crops to disease. They couldn't cut hay. They couldn't feed animals. It hit 6 months later when there was a lot of sediment in the feed, and then the animals got sick. So this is just to say the impacts are not just the moment of climate crisis or erratic weather, but the kind of continued challenging conditions. $44.7 million was the estimated loss last year. And then we had another flood this year, but I made these slides before that. And to make sure that y'all know, because this is a bit in the weeds, but it is really important to understand that federal insurance programs largely don't work for Vermont producers. Over 70% of our farmers report not having crop insurance to the Agency of Agriculture, and that's because those programs are really not designed to support folks who are not large consolidated commodity. So that's like if you have 10,000 acres of soy and it gets hit, you might even make money with the way our subsidies are set up right now. If you have 10 acres that's diversified, that is like some strawberries and some greens, and maybe you have chickens for eggs, you are not getting anything, really, even if you're enrolled in these programs. I mean, the scale is this. We had a farmer who lost $15,000 in strawberry crop. That image was from their strawberries. They lost $15,000. It was half of their yearly net. It took 3 weeks to fill out the paperwork. They weren't allowed to clean up until an agent came out and explored the site. And it took a number of technical service providers to navigate how to even do the NAP program insurance payout forms. And they received a payout that was like congratulatory. They received $300. So that is also a reality. There's not really a way to insure the farms right now. So they're just out on a limb. This is about the cost of land. So I'm assuming I don't need to tell the conservation community, land prices are going up and up and up. And that includes farmland, right? So if you're trying to get into farming, you are up against a really high purchase price and a very high mortgage rate, right? Vermont in particular is experiencing home spikes out even on a curve that's outside of the national average. People are wanting to move here. People are willing to buy land at a very high cost. And what that means is it's really hard to buy into a system knowing you're not going to make the money back, right? So here are some Vermont-specific cost of land statistics. Thank you, Maggie. So just some data-driven specs here. We've seen a 400% increase in 20 years. And we have seen the Vermont Department of Taxes reporting that the median sale price of open land increased almost 20% in 1 year. And then 8% again. So it's like just a very steep curve, right? This is from a recent news article that just came out, I just read. This is about that same pattern of corporate consolidation that we see in the whole sort of grocery and food supply chain. We're now seeing corporate consolidation in farmland ownership itself, the ownership of the land, right? And this quote gave me a particular knot in my stomach. So I'm just pulling it out here, which is to say that the investor-driven farmland gold rush has come with many unintended consequences for ag and farmers. It's led to the consolidation of farmland in regions with high-value land, that's us, while pricing out the farmers unable to compete with major investors. This has led land-strapped farmers to either drop out of farming or become tenant farmers operating farms on rented land. That's not a thriving future, right? Because we remember from what happened with Horizon, what happens if the farmland is no longer making a profit, or if the corporation wants to make more money and more money and more money? There's not this community benefit, this community mindedness, this center of the town thing happening anymore, right? This is a national, this is about sort of the national reality of trying to be a small scale farmer. So all over the country, small farmers have been making less and less money. But you can see that they're making the lessest amount up in the northern part of the country, right? This is because of our land base, and this is because our economic system, which is about consolidation and sameness, it is really hard to farm the same way in an appropriate scale way here in Vermont. So it's just really hard to make the money. These are Vermont-specific economic trends, and I really want to make it clear what these graphs mean. Thank you to my colleague friends at Farm to Plate who gave me these graphs. This is to say that for farms, this is a per acre graph. So farms that are 100 to 139 acres are losing an average of $8,000 a year to operate. Percentage of farms reporting net losses is up, right? 57%. So what this means is 57% of people still trying to produce food in our state and tend the land are doing so at a personal loss of money in service to their community. This is pretty shocking. What this means is that other folks, many of these situations, the other partners working off farm, or people who are farming have another job trying to pay for the farm. Yeah. Sorry, this part's depressing. But there are seeds of hope, right? This is to illuminate to you, this is the reality that farmers are in right now. This is not like the 90s where there was a boom in organic farming and you could get a really high pay price at market and people were slowly waking up to like, oh, how we grow food really matters. We're willing to pay more in the marketplace. And people could make a small, modest, but a living doing this work. It's not like that right now. It's really hard. And when we gather as a membership, folks need to do a lot of processing about what a struggle it is right now and how isolated they feel, how unseen they feel. They're like, I'm trying to feed my community. I'm losing money doing it. I'm trying to do right by the land. I'm getting clobbered by climate events, and I have no safety net. So when I think about Vermont and what I love about Vermont is that we have this beautiful landscape. We have still appropriate scale agriculture. We have appropriate scale politics, in my view. If you want to make something happen, you could probably talk to your legislator like today, right? We have appropriate scale community size where we can actually know each other in many ways. We have an opportunity to really get it right here in Vermont. And when we get things right in Vermont, often the rest of the country really listens. We did it with civil unions, right? We've done this before where we say, like, we think another way is possible. Could we really wrap arms around something and demonstrate that we can come together across difference to make a different path possible? Because if we lose our farmers, if we lose how we produce food, we're in a very, very precarious situation where the land is going to be either protected but humans can't interact with it, or developed, or not producing food for the community. And what we think about all the time at NOFA is, how do we build a bridge now that works today, and it also works in the world that we're trying to build, and it also works in case there is more turbulence coming, which seems pretty likely. And so for me, when I think about what I want to be investing in, I think about small scale farms, strong communities, because we need it now and we're going to need it in the future. And so coming back to this food security in Vermont, this roadmap to 2035. So a little bit about how this came to be, which is a plan, right? And this is something I'd also like to stress about the roadmap. I've been reading a lot about, hey, over the last 10 to 15 years, the left has done a really good job of mobilizing people to be in the streets. We have seen a lot of people in the streets in protest for a lot of reasons over the last 15 years. Actually, numerically, some of the most mobilization in our country's history. And yet we have not seen correlated wins in policy and systemic changes in our leadership. What is the gap? We really care, but we have less rights than we did 15 years ago. The gap is strategy and durable organizing across sectors and coalitions, right? So what I'm excited about the food security roadmap is, do I think it's perfect? Probably not. But it is a pretty good strategic plan that identifies, first we'll do this, and then we can do this thing that builds on it, and then we can ask for this thing. And if we do all these steps, we will get somewhere different. It is a strategy that happened through a lot of people participating. And the other best part is that there's a lot of people from different sectors, farm associations, yes, but also like cities and town planner type folks, and also food security people and people doing immediate mutual aid style food distribution. And also folks thinking about people having access to land who've historically been marginalized from land ownership or pushed off the land are all in agreement that we're going to do this plan together. So even if it's imperfect, we're going to try and stick with it together, and that feels like a really big opportunity. So this project started really because first we saw in COVID bare grocery store shelves, and I thought this was a hilarious photograph because I said to our communications team, does anybody have a picture left over of like some of the bare grocery store shelves in COVID when we all went in and there was no food? And Emily Landenberger, God love her, was like, I have one of my co-op. And I was like, this is just peak Vermont. Like the photograph is the co-op's empty buckets. But even the co-op's empty buckets were empty from commodity foods that got filled in there, right? So we had this experience collectively of like, oh shit, our food system is kind of brittle. right? Like it relies on a whole lot of things being in place to get that food to us. That doesn't feel super safe. What if it lasts a little bit longer next time? That doesn't feel like a great plan. Again, because it's consolidated and not local. And then on the other end of that span, we had flooding, right? Really intensive flooding right here in Vermont. And I think there was a time when many of us in Vermont were thinking like, we are in this awesome position. We are in the most desirable, 5 of the most desirable 10 zip codes for the climate crisis are right here in Vermont. What we're going to be dealing with is gazillions of people who want to live here, and we'll just have to figure out how to manage them all. And then what we learned is like, oh no, we're also underwater, and we're going to be underwater again, right? Like we're not immune. There's no Vermont exceptionalism. We're all in the same boat, right? And even like our farmers in the floodplains are getting flooded. Our farmers up on top of the hill are having all their soil washed away. There's no safe place to hide. So all we have is really mutual solidarity around the issues that we're facing. We're going to take them seriously and act accordingly. So if you are familiar with Vermont Farm to Plate, I'm assuming most people are familiar with Vermont Farm to Plate. As you know, there was a big effort over the last 10 years to come up with the Vermont Ag and Food System Strategic Plan. And that was published a couple years back. And one of the goals in that strategic plan was to create a Vermont food security plan. It was like one of the goals. And when these multiple crises came together, a number of us coalition partners said together, we need to work on this now. The time is right. Let's do it. So we have spent the last several years writing this plan through a collaborative, sort of interactive process with interest holders. So again, this just sort of maps it out, but to make this clear, we are a number of organizations that we'll list out, but there also over 600 Vermonters, individuals, provided input to the Vermont Food Security Plan. What would make them food secure? What makes our landscape secure? What does safety really mean to us? These are all things that we're exploring. And so our roadmap goals, the 3 large buckets, is that government is going to ensure food security. We're going to make sure everyone in our state is food secure. Vermont farms are going to have the resources they need to be resilient, given all of the situation that I just shared about with you that they're up against. And also that communities have the tools they need to really support food security. Those things are all going to happen through this plan. So again, who's the core team? Right now, the core team is the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, the Land Access and Opportunity Board, the Intervale Center, us, NOFA, the Vermont Food Bank, Hunger Free Vermont, and Feeding the Valley Alliance. And what I hope you see is like, it's not just farming associations, it's not just food security associations, it's not just mutual aid associations, nor policy organizations. We're coming together to face this wicked problem together. So I saw that we had a printout in our folder about agreements and how to be together. And one of the things we have found is that it's really the how we are together becomes really important for what kind of work we can do together. So we are lucky, again, back to that appropriate scale of relationship here in Vermont, that we actually really know each other. Many of us know each other in many ways. And we've worked together, we've kind of tested this out, working together on specific initiatives or projects over the years. And there's a lot of deep trust. And still, we need to ground in how we want to act. So shout out to the Land Access and Opportunity Board folks who brought these agreements to us. But we begin every time we meet visioning for like 5 minutes what it's going to be like in 2035 when we've won these goals. What the land's going to look like, how clean the water is going to be, how good it is going to be to feel like kids in our state are not going to sleep hungry. And we start there so that we have real clarity of purpose. That's where we're going. And we often share food. We take time to be in retreat together. We go away. We make time for this work that takes time. And we talk about going slow to go far. So right now we're in a glowing slow phase, and we may always work in a slow manner because that is required to really achieve these big policy goals that we have. So again, these are our goals. They're in government, farms, and communities coming together. And in particular, as it relates to farm viability, just making this point as clear as possible that food security relies on farms being viable because food comes from the earth. And it seems so obvious, and yet so much of our policy seems to not connect these two, that food is what we grow from the earth and we need to do that. And if we don't do that here in Vermont, all we're doing is externalizing the production of it elsewhere and hoping that those supply chains stay strong and that we can truck in food from somewhere else where they're doing it. Because that's how we get food. I'm like always trying to make this point. So our farmers are growing the food that we need and that our region needs, because we are an agricultural state in a region that's quite urban. And our Vermont farms are supported in that key role that we play, that we can continue feeding people in our region, right? And we cannot just think that farmers are gonna keep doing it out of the good of their hearts. If they are not compensated and they are losing money, there will only be so many years that they can do that. And the final point I really want to make is that farm viability is really about more than economics. Farmers are integral to their communities, the health of the land, and collective food security. So if you think about like the small farm as a keystone indicator, like you think about the coho salmon. I had a teacher when I used to work in Northern California, and we worked to open rivers up for the coho salmon to run, right? And we talked about clean, cold, and copious for the coho salmon. If we see coho salmon running in these rivers, we will know we have healthy and strong and intact ecosystems. And I think in Vermont, small-scale farms thriving with their communities could similarly be such a keystone indicator for us. Is it possible to grow food in a way that's good for the planet? Is it possible to get that food to everyone in your community? Do you have the supports that you need to be able to feed your community? That would be an indicator of a healthy culture. So in particular, these are the four sort of top-level goals that we have around farms. One is providing direct, easy-to-access financial support to farmers who provide these essential services to Vermont. A second is to accelerate the permanent conservation of Vermont's ag lands as working farms. A third is to provide essential and urgently needed investments in ag supply chain infrastructure. And a fourth is to establish easier and more equitable access to farmland and on-farm infrastructure. The plan can be found online, so there's a lot more detail that you can read into. But obviously we're here at a conservation conference. So what role might conservation have to play in achieving these farm-related goals? Understanding how we farm is really rooted in how we tend our land. And these are just some of the questions that we have. Do we have the tools in place to adequately address these challenges, like land access, sufficiently? Are we willing to make the changes if we do not have those tools? Can we tweak the tools that we have, or do we need to build new tools? It's a question. And can conservation use your positionality to constellate these connections between social and environmental justice with land at the center? So if our goal is to connect, as we learned in the bill, climate resilience, a working landscape, and these communities that are harmonious with the lands around them, which is the bill's goal, as stated by the bill, what do we need to do to make sure we're doing that? What does that look like? Is there a way to hold in mind, hey, a product of what we're gonna achieve with this work is true food security? Is there gonna be climate resilient? We're gonna have farms producing land. We're gonna have people with access to that food. It's gonna be dope. And I want to point out, and I'm appreciative of really starting the day grounded in this conversation about how equity and justice, and particularly a history of racism, and in this nation, I think we really cannot overstate the entire legacy of how we have done agriculture. Started with a genocide and forced removal of a peoples, and then the enslavement of another peoples for generations and generations. And then we stopped doing that, and we never did repair work. We've never done that work. And so we're only a few generations out from the most violent of the way that system was. And there's a big question facing us. Like, what are we willing to do to seriously look at the legacy that has founded our country and our country's, in particular, our country's whole agricultural system? Are we willing to do the work that's needed to rectify that? And this from Land Justice Futures, which is an amazing organization. If you don't know it, I highly recommend it. But they point out that 98% of the land in the US is owned by white people institutions. In Vermont, it's even higher. And 1,500 acres of that land are developed every day. When we peel back the layers of the climate crisis, we see this history of violence of both people and the earth. And I think this points us back to what's good for people is good for the land. And what's good for people collectively, what's good repair work, that work of really looking at where we've been and making a different choice is going to be good for our communities and for our landscape. Land justice is calling us to radically transform this reality. It's the practice of healing the land, protecting it from extraction, and restoring stewardship to Black, Indigenous, and other dispossessed communities. And this point that they make about it, the time is really ripe, just to sort of point us back to Vermont, that in 2023, the Vermont Community Resilience and Biodiversity Protection Act directed the state to conserve 50% of our total land area by 2050. This resulting conservation strategy initiative is going to help set targets for conservation of agriculturally significant lands and refine our land conservation strategies. And so we need to do that work guided by the findings that we've also called for from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, along with the recommendations from the Land Access and Opportunity Board. To do those at the same time, we totally can do that. So some of those strategies look like removing as many barriers as we can to farmland ownership, exploring alternative ways to access farmland that's not just a nuclear family purchasing land, providing direct payments to farmers. So this is just another way of what do we subsidize? Kind of making the point that right now we do as a nation subsidize farming. We just subsidize large consolidated farms that are owned by corporations. We could choose to subsidize small farms that are at appropriate scale that heal the planet. We could do that here in our state of Vermont. In Europe, they do it through the BIS system. That's what keeps farms small. It keeps the land tended very well. And it ensures viability of farming so that people are not losing money year over year. So there's many models for how we can make direct payments to farmers and farm workers. And updating our food supply chain infrastructure so that we can process food here and have food here in a more sort of local, regional approach is gonna really buffer us from these more global infrastructure challenges, right? So like in one example, organic grain is mainly grown in Ukraine. And then because of the way that they can grow it there, and then they store it, and then they ship it. And when both COVID and then the war in Ukraine happened, the cost to organic dairy farms here was astronomical, right? So like we're all enmeshed, and then organic farmers in Vermont can't access grain. It is hard to find organic grain. So we don't have what we need here. So we have to build what we need here as part of our conservation strategy. And I think one of the lessons from the 30 by 30 work that we're all involved in from the food security roadmap work is this: how can we have more deep collaboration and sort of admit no one of our perspectives is gonna be sufficient for this work. It's a huge, audacious goal, and we have a real opportunity that is juicy and could be extremely meaningful for what we do in Vermont and sort of what we model out to the rest of the nation. And I think that if we can collaborate around that more, that will be really exciting, because that is how we're going to get those durable strategies that people are willing to agree to do. So this is a picture of an empty road. Thank you, Becca. That symbolizes like, where are we going? Where do we want to be in 2035? And this is another exciting way to think about, or in 2030 or in 2050, when we achieve these goals, what are we going to see? And I think taking time to really ground in a vision around like, what is it going to look like in Vermont when we've done this in 2050, and make sure that the things that we're seeing, we're building a strategy to make happen. So sort of the choice is ours, and we feel like if our conservation partners who are interested in food security, climate resilience, farm viability would take time to be with the food security roadmap and reach out to us as roadmap organizations working on the roadmap, we'd love to collaborate. You have the experience about the mechanics of how this might be able to work. We have the willingness and sort of our building power and energy around the ideas and bringing people together around the ideas of a path to true food security, which means climate resilience, a healthy planet, healthy farms. And we're hoping that we can work together in the coming years ahead. And I got us back on time. Just spoke a little bit louder, but quicker. But that is my talk, and I'm curious if folks have questions before we go.
Thank you, Grace.
Yeah, Fran. Thank you all. Are there any questions for either for me or for any of the other roadmap partners? We're here, yeah.
Is there any data right now on like how much Vermont's food system is local? How much local food we have in Vermont?
Yes. You're saying no. Oh, okay. I was looking at you. My one. Yes, the New England Feeding New England, the NEFNI is the acronym for that. They have compiled a lot of data on what's coming from where, as has Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund.
Yeah, we do a local food count. I think it's every 5 years through the Farm to Plate network. And so I don't have the actual number because I'm not good at remembering actual numbers, but definitely if you look up at the food system atlas or Google Farm to Plate network, there's data there. We keep shared data for the food system through the Farm to Plate network, and that information about the local food count number, so it's a percentile, will be there along with all the supporting information.
Yeah.
Yes, Liz. Is there any like specific policy recommendations that you're making this legislative session that you would like us to know about? This is not a leading question.
Like, yes, indeed. There are. We are in the, when I talked about sort of going slow to go far, we are currently in a process because all these organizations, right, NOFA is bringing a couple of policy pushes this year, and so is the food bank, and so is, you know, Hunger Free. And so we're working on developing a really succinct one-pager of like, these are all of the food security roadmap priorities, and figuring out like, hey, what should fall outside the scope versus be in here. Certainly takes time, especially because this is the first year we're really doing that work. So we don't have the one-pager yet, but we know of a number of things that are coming forward for sure. As it relates to NOFA, one of the things that we have pushed for in the past that we'll be back asking for an appropriation to be in base funding are for programs like Farm Share, which is a food access program that goes, it's sort of a double benefit program. So it goes directly to the consumer to use to the limited income Vermonter, and they can only spend that money directly on Vermont's small scale farms. So it's like impacts both. That's something we know we're bringing, but there are a number of initiatives that will be coming forward. And we're working really hard. This is the sort of like durable strategy part. We know we need a climate emergency fund, for example, for farmers. Farmers are not covered by FEMA. They're like a different bucket than all other businesses. So we have had to go to the state and make these cases each flood that we need money and we have to fight for it and it takes time. We know we need a climate emergency fund. We are working as a team to really bake a strategy in such a way that we have a coalition behind it that will be really strong. So we have a whole bunch of farming associations at the table, including like the Farm Bureau and watershed coalitions and people who farm all different ways who are struggling in the face of the climate crisis. But we're also trying to bake it in such a way that points to these longer term goals, like providing direct, easy to access financial support. So we're trying to figure out, how do we make policy change that is like stepwise incremental change to the big thing that we want, which is really like direct payments to farmers and farm workers. We don't need it to be so complicated and come out through grants and through emergency funding when folks are struggling. We want people to be so viable that they can handle a shock wave in the system of a big storm. That's not the reality now, and most farms wouldn't be able to continue on if they got absolutely no remuneration, right? So what's the way we craft a policy that indicates and points lawmakers to, like, don't forget, this is a step towards a more holistic investment in the working landscape, while also sort of taking a win when we can. So you will see a docket. I mean, is there anything else y'all would say about policy stuff that's coming forward? Travis, Becca?
I think that's great.
Yeah, you'll see a docket that comes forward that's like our policy goals as a coalition. And it looks like some money for hunger relief. It looks like some money for sort of more upstream, like providing more farm viability funds. Any other questions? Yes.
Grace, that was just a good presentation. I just wanted to push you a little bit or get your comment about actually your second bullet, accelerates permanent conservation. Does it really matter if the most, looking at where we spend our resources, the VHCB spends a lot of money on permanent conservation of ag land. Does it really matter if most of those lands are going to large, you talked about consolidation, and that's, it may be not the scale that you talked about nationally, but there's a lot of consolidation going on here in Vermont for sure. There's what, 34 LFOs? I don't know if any of those are signed up with NOFA. Probably not.
We don't have any.
And most of that land that might be conserved will go to those consolidation properties. And just wanted to see whether that was talked about. And should we be spending those resources?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a totally good question, and it's one that I think would require a lot of member engagement and actually involving people who are going to be stewarded by these choices. If we could have like a holistic land use plan for the whole state of Vermont that the state put forward and a tax map that reflected it, that would be ideal, right? Like that would be, and this is where, like, these are steps that could get us there. Perhaps there's a more holistic solution that's like completely redo the land use plan of Vermont that we could do. We would need conservation partners to inform us and tax planning partners to inform us how the hell to do that, because most of us are, none of us in the coalition have that expertise, but it's something we're starting to talk about. What are those strategies? Where in the world are those happening, right? Like, is that what's happening in Europe that's making it successful? Is that, what could achieve that, right? What are the structures? Conservation is like a tool we have now. Our concern about the exclusion of ag lands being counted in this first part of the process is about sort of like impact and intent, understanding the concern that you're raising for sure. And again, this is where I'm like a little sweaty because I don't fully know, and I'm sure I'm stepping on somebody's toes, so sorry. But I don't feel a lot of heat about it. What we understand is like this first part of the process is just about sort of putting broad parameters around what's important to us. And then there's going to be refinement about working on some of the problems that you raise. Like, well, how does this, and also equity, right? Like, how does this plan actually work to address access to folks who have never had land access in this country by design, right? Like, that's gonna take time to figure out, I'm not sure, but if farming is automatically whole hog, sort of like not included as a potential solution for biodiversity, that also feels like a big problem. So it's sort of like, I don't know where the broad strokes and then the refining happens is part of the process. But that's our concern right now, is just like, hey, farming actually can be a very important watershed, healer, biodiversity increaser. When people in the land work well together, like we were hearing at this morning's keynote, that is got to be a part of the solution. And so my point is just saying, like, hey, we can't overlook the fact that we still need to produce food. It's already really, really hard to be a farmer. And our concerns are that in other places where some of this work has already happened, some of the fallout, and again, not being in conservation and not knowing much, but I have, as part of my work in La Via Campesina, being a member of this international peasants' rights movement, is a lot of indigenous people and a lot of small scale, very appropriate scale agriculture has been pushed off of the land. And as a result, and I think it might be in some cases it's probably like corporations who don't care, they're profit maximizing, that's what they're doing, and they'll sort of do it until they like, what is it called with snake eats its own tail? Like, eats everything up. But I think there's also some sort of like, the intent is good. We want to protect biodiversity, and the impact means like then these indigenous folks who have actually been stewarding biodiversity, or these small scale people who keep our sort of our forests working and healthy and biodiverse, like that's how we do that, right? So I am not clear yet about how the mechanics of that should work, and what does repair and reparation look like as a part of this process. I'm also not clear about, but I'm sure that if we do the process in a way that is slow enough that we can involve more people who are smarter than I am, we will be very, very, very smart together, and we can solve some of these problems like you're raising. If we could talk about that in a way that brought people in, and then figure out like, yeah, what are some of the other possibilities so that we aren't replicating these problems that we're trying to solve. More questions? I know that we kind of have to go to the next session, but thank you for letting me share with you. And if you want to learn more about the food security roadmap process, I would love to talk with you. And I really appreciate all that you're doing, because I know everybody who's here is deeply committed to a thriving future. And so it's exciting to get to have these conversations where we can imagine how we could do that better together. Thanks, y'all.